How do we accept anxiety and willfully tolerate it? Well, today we're talking about the role of core values and doing what matters when triggered. So let's go. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to The Anxious Truth. This is the podcast and YouTube channel that covers all things anxiety, anxiety disorders, and anxiety recovery. This is part 3 in our little 3-part series on accepting anxiety. In parts 1 and 2, which would be episodes 309 and 310 of this podcast, we explored how to observe our anxious experiences mindfully and how to begin opening up to different ways of responding when we're anxious. Today, we're going to dive into something that might sound simple, but actually runs surprisingly deep, which is using our values to guide our responses when anxiety shows up. It's complicated, but we'll get to it, right? So if you are new here to The Anxious Truth, I am Drew Linsalata. I am creator and host of this podcast. I am a therapist practicing under supervision, pre-licensed in the state of New York, at least as of early 2025, specializing in the treatment of anxiety and anxiety disorders. I am a former sufferer of these exact problems, including panic disorder, agoraphobia, OCD, and depression for many years of my life, but better now. I'm also a 3-time author on this topic, a social media advocate, a content creator, and I am trying to use my experience and now my formal training and expertise to help other people get through the problems that I once got through myself. So when you listen to The Anxious Truth or watch these podcast episodes, remember that I'm talking from academic, theoretical, professional standpoint, but also from a personal standpoint. I will never try to hold up my personal experiences as the things that you should do, but keep in mind that I do kind of understand how you feel. This is not easy stuff. It can be really hard. So before we get into today's podcast episode, just reminder that The Anxious Truth is more than just this podcast or this YouTube video. There's a ton of more resources on my website, a ton of more resources. Listen to me, I can't talk today. There are many more resources that are related to anxiety and anxiety recovery on my website at theanxioustruth.com. If you're watching on YouTube, it's on the screen right below me. Go check it out. Most of the stuff is free, like the old podcast episodes and videos, all my social media content and things of that nature. And even the things that do carry a cost, like my workshops, which generally tend to be an hour or 2 long, are at a very low cost. Everybody tells me that the resources are helpful. So head on over to the website at theanxioustruth.com and check them out. I think you'll be happy that you did. So let's get back to today's episode. We're talking about the third part of the ACT triflex. We'll get to that, which is connecting to your core values to help you decide what to do next when you are triggered and trying to find other options. So we'll use an example. We'll use agoraphobia as our example. Let's say that you are struggling with agoraphobia right now, or maybe you're struggling with recurring panic attacks, which is very highly related. You might find yourself constantly second guessing how to handle those moments when panic or anxiety gets triggered. You may be fully embracing the whole acceptance, tolerance, willful tolerance, floating, facing, approach, but you're confused. Okay, what am I supposed to do then when I get triggered? Should I keep engaging with life? Should I take a break? Should I try to distract myself from how I'm feeling? Am I supposed to face the feelings head on? When anxiety is screaming at you to retreat to safety, it can be almost impossible to know what the right, and I'm using air quotes, response should be. This is where sometimes anxious people who are working on the recovery process can kind of get paralyzed by the need to do it right so it works, which means that they might get stuck still trying to figure out how to do the thing that stops anxiety and fear dead in its tracks. And this is something that we are never talking about. You guys may know me in this podcast long enough to know that I'm always going to remind you of that. In this context that we're dealing with today, and always on this podcast or on this YouTube channel, the right next move is only the one that's made more consciously and a considered way that has a better chance of moving us toward what we really value and what's important to us, and away from sort of unconscious, reflexive, resistant reactions to anxious fear. That's a mouthful. So let me be clear about something at this right now before we even go further. There is no magic formula that will make these decisions easy. There's no steps. There's no like, this is, if you do this flow chart, you will definitely do the right thing. But what many people discover as they go through their anxiety recovery process, and something that has honestly been validated and included in most of the 3rd wave and 4th wave treatments for anxiety disorders, is that connecting to what really matters, our core values, our values can provide sort of like a compass when anxiety has us feeling lost. Now, values are complicated and they are confusing. We could spend 3 episodes just talking about the topic of values because it's another thing that can be kind of gray and amorphous for so many people. Just keep in mind that when we are talking about values, or I often use the word core values, they're interchangeable. We're not really talking about goals that you achieve or check off a list. So for instance, going to the supermarket without having a panic attack would be great, but that's a goal. It's not a value. Like being calm is a goal. It's not a value. Graduating from college is a goal. It's not a value. Going on a family vacation without anxiety is a goal and a noble one, but it's also not a value. Think of values more like the direction we try to move in. Or we can think of them maybe as like guidelines that will help inform our choices moment by moment, not only when anxious, but throughout our lives. They're not about reaching a particular destination or checking a box. They're really more about sort of how we travel through life. So for example, going on that family vacation that I talked about, or maybe spending more time with loved ones, might reflect values of belonging or caring or being connected. Those are the things that are important to me. Those are my values. And I express them by going on a family vacation instead of avoiding, or spending more time with my family instead of hiding and being consumed with how I feel. You see how those are concepts and guidelines. They're not activities or accomplishments, but I know that this is not so easy to grasp, right? That's okay. Everybody struggles with this one, especially anxious people. So let me give you a little exercise that might help you get a little clearer on your values. Imagine that you're at your own funeral, which I know is not the most comfortable thought, but stick with me here. What would you want the people who matter most to you at your funeral to say about how you lived your life? What qualities would you want them to remember about you? For instance, maybe your best friend is delivering your eulogy. The answer to this question, odd though it may sound, can often point to our deepest values. And this is a common ACT exercise, acceptance and commitment therapy, that we use with therapy clients to help them discover or reconnect with actually matters to them. Because when you're anxious or afraid all the time, it can be a little easy to dump all those values on the floor and get completely consumed with just feeling better and trying to not be afraid. And I get that. That's not a crime. But this is why we start to work actively on reconnecting values as a way to help us learn how to take other paths and explore other options when we're uncomfortable and feeling distressed or afraid or anxious, right? So let's take a look at how this might play out in real life. We'll go back to agoraphobia as the example. Imagine an agoraphobic faced with attending a concert at their child's school. Holiday concerts, holidays ended a couple of months ago, but very common, right? Anxiety is telling this person to stay home because there it's safe. In this moment, if that person, our agoraphobic friend, is connected to his or her values, perhaps being present for their children, being involved in their important moments can help inform their next move. Right? If they can connect to the values of connectedness or belonging or community, they might be able to say, hey, I do have other options and I'm going to express that value by going to the concert instead of staying home and monitoring my anxious state. Or if we look at somebody who has OCD, for instance, that person at a family gathering might be having a great time. And then suddenly all the intrusive thoughts come rushing in for some unknown reason that make that person incredibly uncomfortable, almost near panic in some instances. Their immediate urge might be to leave or perform their behavioral or mental rituals to try to make the thoughts stop and the discomfort go away. And then it takes them out of the environment that they would rather be in. If that person is better connected with the value of maybe connectedness or being kind or loving, they might be able to get a little bit more present with the family, and it might choose to help them stay and try to engage, say, in the conversation, even while those thoughts and feelings are there. It's really uncomfortable, but we're looking for ways to respond in more considered ways. And one way that we could do that, as these 2 examples show us, would be to connect to our values, because they help us decide, well, what am I going to do next? I'm really afraid right now, but what am I going to do, right? So here's where it gets a little bit nuanced. Sometimes living in accordance with our values means staying engaged with life, whatever that looks like, while anxiety is present, like our friend with OCD who is choosing to stay connected to the conversation at the family gathering. But other times it might mean pausing to be with our anxiety mindfully, learning through the direct experience of being with it fully, that while uncomfortable, it isn't actually dangerous or damaging, and the disaster that it protects is not a thing that needs to be considered, right? So this is where we get into that sit with it thing that some people kind of take literally and get confused by. And if that's you, don't worry about it. Lots of people get confused by this. Well, if we talk about doing what matters in the context of this podcast episode and YouTube video, what matters often means not actually sitting with it, but bringing the experience with you into whatever version of life you're attempting to engage with at the moment. Now, probably not optimally, but you can still try to engage with the life that matters to you rather than stopping everything to try to take care of your anxious state. But also on the flip side, sometimes doing what matters will actually mean stopping to sit with it or stand with it or lie with it or walk with it or whatever. Because sometimes we find that we are falling back into resistance or trying to get present as a technique for feeling better. In those moments, doing what matters, getting closer to the life that we want and the things that we really care about might tell us to take a quick pause, to actually sit or stand quietly, to face the anxious experience and allow it more fully. This is crazy subtle. It can even take people working with an anxiety specialist a while to get a grip on this. So if you're not sure after listening to a podcast episode or watching a YouTube video or 10 YouTube videos, what this even means, that's really okay. It's not just you. This is a counterintuitive process that takes time to get familiar with. It takes practice. It takes repeated experiences. And geez, when do we ever hear that on The Anxious Truth? A confusing, counterintuitive, paradoxical process. Who saw that coming, right? So jokes aside, we can go back to what Dr. Russ Harris, who's very big in the ACT community. You can Google him. He's awesome. He calls this the ACT triflex. And I'll review that quickly. There are 3 points in the triflex. Think of it as a triangle: being present, opening up, and today we're talking about doing what matters. When we're fully present and objectively describing our experience non-judgmentally, we can notice the anxiety and actually see what's happening rather than getting carried away into the judgment or the assessment or the prediction. When we open up, the second point in the triflex, we create space for those difficult feelings, and we at least consider that we may have other options rather than resisting and fighting against them. And today we're talking about the third point, which is when we connect with our values, the things that really matter with us, we can begin to start to choose actions that actually do matter in our lives, even when anxiety, fear, discomfort, uncertainty, even panic is along for the ride. Like, this is possible. And if we look at the ACT triflex as our framework, like I've been talking about the last couple of episodes, this gives us sort of a framework on how to actually practically accept anxiety. So at this point, it's really worth noting that choosing value-guided actions when you're anxious and uncomfortable and afraid really depends heavily on those first 2 points of the triflex that we talked about in episodes 309 and 310. Mindful awareness and opening up to new experiences. Without the ability to notice objectively and non-judgmentally what's happening when you're triggered, without creating a little space between yourself and your anxious experiences, taking just this part, which is like act based on your values, can feel overwhelming or even impossible in a lot of cases. When we're super caught up in a storm of anxiety or panic or intrusive thoughts, and we haven't yet learned and practiced stepping back to observe what's happening non-judgmentally, when we're still automatically, reflexively, unconsciously fighting against against the experiences or trying to run from it or be saved from it or escape from it, that's when choosing meaningful action that aligns with our values is most confusing and difficult and starts to feel impossible for a lot of people. This is why things get frustrating. And this is why we spend time in the first 2 parts of this series talking about building those fundamental scales of awareness and openness, because they really do matter. And while we're talking about the first point, which is learning to get present and non-judgmentally observing your anxiety, if you're interested in learning practical ways to do that and to apply the principles of mindfulness within the context of anxiety recovery, you can check out my practical mindfulness skill group, which is on my website at learn.theanxioustruth.com. These are very small groups of no more than 10 people that meet weekly for 6 weeks. They include in-meeting mindfulness practices, between meeting homework and practice, and plenty of discussion and opportunities to ask questions and get feedback on this topic. Again, you can check that out yourself. That's at learn.theanxioustruth.com. So I want to acknowledge something that's really important here, I think. Choosing a value-based response when you're anxious, triggered, panicky, in the middle of a raging storm of really scary thoughts, it's not easy. Our brains are wired to react automatically to a threat, real or perceived, it doesn't matter. Resisting anxiety, fighting it, or trying to escape from it often feels like the most logical response in the moment. And yes, giving into those urges might provide temporary relief. That's why we do it. But here's what I've learned, both professionally and personally, as I've gone through my life, is that temporary relief often comes at the cost of moving away from what matters most to us. Each time we choose sort of instant comfort or instant relief over our values, we reinforce the idea that anxiety is something that we cannot handle, or something to be avoided at all costs, or a problem that can be hacked or fixed or solved or figured out or researched to death. Learning to pause in those moments, connecting with our values, choosing a meaningful response, even if it's uncomfortable, takes time and practice. There is no shortcut here, no quick fix that will make this simple or easy. I wish there was. But in my experience, this approach leads to a life that feels more meaningful and fulfilling, even if anxiety is still part of the journey while you're learning how to do this. Don't let that discourage you, right? So really, I would encourage you to start spending a little bit more time reflecting on your values. What truly matters to you? What kind of person do you want to be? How do you want to show up in your relationships or your work or your life? These answers can serve as your compass when anxiety, discomfort, fear, uncertainty, distress just feels overwhelming. And remember, I'm always going to remind you of this. The goal is never to knock down your anxiety. It's not to not be anxious. The goal here, the reason why we're even talking about accepting anxiety, floating, surrendering, willfully tolerating it, is to be able to feel anxious and still move in directions that matter to you. Sometimes that movement might be small, and that's okay. What matters is that you're guided by your values in those moments, even a little bit by your values, rather than completely controlled by anxiety and fear. This really matters. The object of the game is not to squash your anxiety through acceptance. The object of the game is to understand that I don't have to squash my anxiety. If I learn to work through it and move closer to my values, even when I'm comfortable, I begin to recognize that, like, hey, this is a misguided, misfiring threat response. It's still safe. And I can sort of teach my brain to go back into its normal patterns where anxiety, fear, panic, discomfort, alarm detection, and threat detection goes back into their rightful place. And I don't have to worry about anxiety all the time. So don't mishear that as connect to your values and you'll just get good at being a horribly anxious person for the rest of your life. It's not about that. It's about knowing that right now you might have to learn to try to live a value-driven life while anxious. But in the end, the happy secondary effect is if we can learn to do that and we can apply these principles, often we wind up in a much less anxious state overall. We can't promise that, but is a really good chance that that's where you wind up. You just got to be patient as you learn to get to that state. And as we wrap up this series, I just want to remind you that learning to accept anxiety and choosing value-based responses is a practice. There's a reason why we use terms like mindfulness practice. You will not do it perfectly, and you don't need to. Each moment is a new opportunity to notice what's happening and to open up to that experience, to choose a response that aligns with what matters to you and to learn from that. That's really what we want to do here. So many people spend so much time talking about trying to heal from their anxiety, but I will submit that the whole process of learning how to accept anxiety that we've been talking about for 3 full podcast episodes and YouTube videos is a process of learning, because the improvement comes through experiential learning and building an openness to experiences and moving closer to what matters. That's not a healing problem. That's a learning problem. And I think everybody can learn. Otherwise I wouldn't be doing this. So anyway, that is episode 311 of The Anxious Truth in the books. And as we end the episode, I'm going to ask you guys the same favors I ask at the end of every episode. You're probably tired of it, which is to rate and review the podcast if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, because it does help more people get the help that they're looking for. And if you're watching on YouTube, maybe like the video or subscribe to my channel, or even maybe share the video with somebody that you think might need it if you're sort of watching on YouTube, right? So that certainly helps, and I appreciate it. And remember, we're always talking about doing difficult things here. Sometimes scary things, but not actually difficult things, and not actually dangerous things. That's so important. Scary and difficult do not always equal dangerous. So please keep that in mind. Be nice to yourself while you attempt to use these concepts and principles in your own anxiety recovery. Do not forget that when you take a step forward, you should acknowledge what you did and do your best to take a lesson from that experience. Again, it's a learning problem here, right? So be mindful of negative judgment. The old Craig the Critic starts to chime in from the Disordered podcast. That's at disordered.fm, by the way. Be mindful of Craig the Critic and his negative judgment directed at yourself and your recovery process, because that can make things even harder than they already are. And it serves no real purpose. You are working on it, and that really is a very big deal. So I will be back again in 2 weeks with another podcast episode. I'm not really sure what we're going to talk about, but I will definitely be here. Maybe we'll do like a viewer mail kind of thing. Thanks for hanging out. I hope you found it helpful. Thanks for taking your time to watch or listen. And I will definitely see you 2 weeks in the next episode. Take care of yourself.